I know, Lynn, you're on. So as soon as I see you pop up, I'll unmute you, or maybe you can unmute yourself. We'll go ahead and get started. And I want to explain why this topic was important to me. Lynn and I have been doing these chats every month, and I think a lot of people have found them pretty helpful, or at least we hope so. And feel free, if it's your first time joining, you can ask questions by dropping them in the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go. Hi, Lynn.
Hello. I take it you're okay out there?
Well, so far. Yeah, keep your fingers crossed. There's a lot of flooding for those of you not in coastal California. It's been pretty grim. So I was just starting to introduce the topic, Lynn, on why it was interesting to me. And then I thought I could hand it over to you to share your thoughts and get things rolling. I'm a little protective of arena riding, as you know, because I think it is so beneficial for the horse. And well, I know it is beneficial for the horse. I've seen horses repair behavior and movement and all kinds of issues, if you will, by learning to become more aligned and balanced. And the irony is, many students will say to me, well, my horse just doesn't like arena work. And in my mind, all I can think is, what body doesn't like being more balanced and aligned and supple? You know, it doesn't make sense. However, are we maybe conflating boredom with dislike? I think maybe sometimes we do. And it's true that many horses are bored by arena work, depending on how you present it. And that's a whole big topic with a lot of nuances, right? How we present things and what the underpinnings of our relationship is with the horse. That is going to affect whether or not the horse enjoys what we're doing. And so I asked Lynn if she would talk about this topic with me, because it's an important one. And some horses are more, I think, inherently suited for particular jobs than other jobs or tasks. However, I do think how we're going about things influences a great deal on whether they're enjoying them. Anyway, Lynn, what are your thoughts on beginning this topic? Where do you want to take our direction today?
Well, you've already raised a really important point about boredom and the arena. I so often see people equate arena with round and round on the rail, or circle after circle after circle. I actually had a student say to me one time, I said, how about you get your horse off the rail and do some other things? And she said, how would I do that? So it's, yeah, you know, it takes some imagination. It takes more thinking ahead. Yeah, to make things more interesting for the horse, to think of different figures and to have a plan. Of course, when you're doing arena work, you have a very clear plan. You're not just repeating the same thing over and over again. You have a plan and a purpose. And I think horses are very attuned to when we have a purpose and when the focus is on them and on the purpose that you have for them. I think most of us do tend to think, well, getting out of the arena, and I've even seen some pretty world-class trainers say, it's really hard to train a horse in the arena because you need to get them out and do things. But it doesn't mean we can't do both too. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of like when we're gauging, you know, I think my horse likes trail riding, or I think my horse enjoys doing obstacles, or, you know, pick your example. What kinds of things are we looking at, do you think, because I think a lot of times our assessment is probably anthropomorphizing, because to be honest, a lot of times when people will say to me, well, my horse doesn't like this particular exercise in your book, a lot of times, if I look closely, it's that the rider is a little bit challenged or sort of annoyed by the exercise, more so than what I perceive in the horse's body language. But what are your ideas, and what are we looking for from the horse in terms of determining whether or not the horse does or doesn't enjoy something?
Well, I think that there's another really important point is, are we projecting our own feelings on the horse? Do we find it difficult? I personally find it difficult to come up with interesting things to do in the arena. And so you've just made me wonder, how much do I project onto my horse? Oh, he's bored because I'm bored, because it's an awful lot of work to come up with the new and interesting things to do. Mm-hmm. But I think the one of the tricky things is to separate the horse's enjoyment of the actual activity from his relationship with the person. I think that's almost impossible to completely separate. And that's logical. You know, if you think about it, any job that you're doing is more fun if you're doing it with a coworker you enjoy. And no matter how much you like the job, a coworker you're not comfortable with can kind of spoil things for you.
That's a good point. You know, I ride a lot with Garrett Heuschman, and he was saying once in a lesson, he said, you want to know the secret to being a really great trainer or a great rider? And I was like, okay, here it comes, you know, here comes the golden nugget. And he said, start by being the type of person your horse enjoys being with, being around. And I thought there's so many characteristics, traits that came to mind right away, right? But that's the foundation. And we're not just talking about dressage, we're talking about anything, trail riding, groundwork, it doesn't matter. But you're right, you can't separate the activity. You can't say, oh, my horse doesn't like XYZ. There's a lot of us enmeshed in that.
Yeah, and there's you can't decide if your horse likes something based on how obedient he is either. This
Yeah.
is, you know, there might be a temptation to say, well, he's cooperative, he's doing all of this, but horses can be obedient because they've been taught that if you're not obedient enough, then life gets kind of unpleasant. There's corrections to happen. And then that's particularly the case if you have a horse who's shut down into learned helplessness. They're just going to robotically go through things. So to know if my horse is enjoying something, I'm looking more for like enthusiasm and initiative. And you can see that in horses doing all kinds of different jobs. You know, if you've ridden a horse who loves to jump, you learn that if you canter past a jump, you need to steer clearly because he may detour to go over the jump. You know, I mean, isn't that the most wonderful feeling? I mean, that's what we're really hoping for. Or the trail horse who you give him a choice at the trail junction and he says, well, we'll take the longer trail away from home instead of heading home. Or we come to a trail obstacle and he doesn't say, well, let's turn around. He says, oh, let me figure out how we get past this obstacle. He's taking the initiative in the job that shows he sees a purpose. And I think that's something that engages horses is when they see a purpose in what they're doing. So I'm wondering, how do you get, when you're working with a horse in a corrective exercise, how do you get them to see a purpose to that? Or do you think they're working more to please you?
Well, that's a good question. And it does come down to having to be creative and skilled with the number of repetitions, because certainly, as with anything, they could become listless or disengage and lose the curiosity that we talked about before, which is so important. But I think with the types of exercises I try to do, I feel like there's such a mind and body connection that it's almost inherently rewarding when they do things right. I see their posture change. I see this reflexive muscular shift through their body, the neck softening, the top line rounding, that sort of thing, without human intervention, but just as a result of doing the exercise. And I think similar to us, now this is, again, I'm saying I think, I can't say I know, but I think it's very soothing for the horse. I think it's like, you know, how can letting go of tension not be soothing is how I see it. But, and then to go back to what you were just saying, when I think of one word, if I had to pick one word to describe horses I've known in the past that I think they really enjoyed what they were doing, the word that comes up is eagerness. They're eager. Now that's different from being like hyper, high as a kite, you know, spastic, right? Eager, I mean, you know, they're like, bring it, you know, what are we doing? Are we playing with that soccer ball? Are we going for a ride with my pals? How about you? How does that resonate with what you interpret as a horse who seems to enjoy what they're doing?
Yes. Yeah. That's sort of taking initiative, showing I'm ready, I'm thinking ahead. You know, a horse who's excited about what we're doing has a sense of, well, here's what we're probably going to be doing next, or here's what I'd like to be doing next. So that horse may even anticipate, well, you're going to ask me to do this, so I'm ready. Just like you said, bring it on. Ask me.
You know what's so interesting, Lynn, because I was reading, this is a look behind the curtains for those of you watching. Lynn had sent me a little outline of the article that she's provided for us today on today's talk. And you mentioned anticipation. And anticipation is one of those things I've had to revisit my impressions around, because for so many of us, I think, and I hear students say this, anticipation is like this negative thing. I'll get a rider doing an exercise, right? Like trot canter transitions is a popular one. Trot canter transitions is incredibly valuable gymnastically. I mean, it's like a magic, simple to do, beneficial exercise. And so I have riders doing this, and then the horse will kind of catch on to it, right? Unless they're restricted or they have pain, and then they don't want no part of it. But if they're eager, like we're talking about, they start to anticipate. And the rider, and certainly I've done this in the past, they get a little frustrated, like, now he's just anticipating. And isn't it funny how negative we are about that? It's like, wait a minute, he's offering something for free. Isn't this a good thing?
Absolutely. That I get excited when the horse anticipates. It says he's thinking, he's paying attention, he's eager to please me. He wants to do what I want us to be doing together. I think it's marvelous. And I know I've been told, but you must never have a dressage horse anticipate, because then if he anticipates in a show, you lose points. Well, they're capable of understanding a difference. So, for instance, my bronze, not a fan of arena work. He'd much rather be out on the trail. But we played some of those games where we do so many steps of this, and or we change gaits at a certain place, and he anticipates. And he also learns patterns and routines. So when we did our first musical freestyle at a dressage show, I forgot my routine partway through. I had no idea, am I turning left or right at this moment? And so I sat there doing nothing, and Bronze remembered what the routine was, and then, which is, that's sort of anticipating. He didn't wait for me. If he'd waited for me to decide what to do, we'd have run into the wall. So he showed me where we were going next. I remembered what I was doing, and nobody knew that I'd forgotten my routine except Bronze. So this is where a horse shows, yeah, I've got what we're doing. I know what the plan is. I know what we're supposed to be doing. And if you don't want your horse anticipating in a show, then you just need to be super clear on your signals and make sure that you've said, at this moment, no thanks. Don't do that.
Yeah. On this topic, Heather just submitted a question, and it's a good one. It's how do we know the difference, or how do we tell the difference between eagerness or anticipation and anxiety? So the example would be an endurance horse at the beginning of an endurance ride. Those can be some electric moments for horses and riders. And many of the horses are excited about what's to come. They know what's to come. There's a lot of energy around them. How do we tell whether they're like, yeah, bring it, or I'm freaking out because all this energy around me? What are your thoughts on this, Lynn?
I think it has a lot to, I would gauge that, I think, a lot by how tuned in the horse is to me. If he's anticipating, he's tuning into me, waiting, like just give me the go ahead. If he's just anxious, I feel like the energy's more scattered and not so tuned into me, but more reactive to other things going on. Does that fit with what you've seen?
Yeah, and I was going to say, certainly there's the physiological pieces, like many of them have runny poo in a situation like that, the diarrhea or the teeth grinding or these sorts of things are an indication it's probably anxiety. Now, sometimes in brief anxiety, an endurance horse at a start line is a very specific example. They are picking up on a whole lot of energy. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's terrible. Now, if you brought your horse out every single day and that was his state of nature, this might be a different conversation. You know what I'm saying? But those horses are so fit and ready to run. And that's probably for many of them a brief period, that state of like, the skin's on fire and I'm higher than a kite. And with, after a few miles, they sort of settle in and they might still have a lot of energy, but hopefully the diarrhea and the anxiety has dissipated. But like I say, if it was a daily thing, that's a different conversation. And we've talked about some of the body language and behaviors around if a horse enjoys what they're doing. On the other side of the coin, there are horses, a lot of times it's because they either don't understand what we're after, or we already used the case of boredom, but aside from boredom, horses that don't understand what we're asking or are uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable in some way. There are a lot of horses that are not seeming to enjoy what they're doing, whatever it is. So things that I see that I think would indicate that are just the common body language, tightness in the eyes, not a big soft open eye, but a really tight eye, or tension where you can see the sclera, or teeth grinding. I see a lot of, teeth gnashing and grinding with horses that are uncomfortable and or unhappy, tail swishing, these sorts of things. Resistance to go forward. That's one we've talked about in the past, so we don't have to belabor that. But these are some things where I'll be like, let's just be creative and see if we can change what we're doing here. It might mean a whole different discipline shift, like we've talked about before. Could just be presenting things in a different way. What are things that you see that seem to indicate when a horse is not having a good time and not enjoying?
One of the classics is you lead them up to the mounting block and the hindquarters swing around so you can't get on, or they're just plain fidgety there, assuming they've been taught and know that they're supposed to stand still. Things like that magnetic lean toward the gate every time you go past, or a trail horse who always wants to take, rush back to the barn. Those are some things that to me say, I'm not happy with my job. But coming back to something you said earlier, I think we need to figure out how much of that is they don't like the job itself, and how much of it might be being physically or emotionally not comfortable or confident with it. So we always look, I think, first at the physical discomfort. And I think a lot of times horses are either over, there's too much repetition, so that they may be stiff and sore. Because I know the work that you do, you've got it very targeted and thinking very carefully about what is best to make them feel better. But I think people often overlook more subtle things like balance issues. You ask a horse to canter in the arena and his balance isn't secure, or his footing's not secure. It may not be that he has any objection to cantering in the arena. It may be that he's trying to say, I don't feel safe. I'm not confident doing this.
Yeah.
So the more you can gauge whether he's physically uncomfortable, then that gives us a hint, where do we start? If his balance isn't good, then we need to be going back to exercises that encourage his balance. If he's emotionally not comfortable in a certain setting, then maybe some investigative behaviors in order. You're in a new arena and there's stuff in the corner and there's things happening outside, and maybe he needs a chance to just walk around and look it over. So I don't think we should decide he's unhappy about his job if the setting or his physical comfort isn't in good shape.
Those are good points. And they remind me of a conversation I had on the podcast last week with Amy Skinner. She was saying that maybe it's a reflection of our times that we're in. I don't know, but we certainly are a species that likes to have things done now, or think that we're quick solutions to things. And she was saying, I think many horse owners have gotten really uncomfortable with the idea that there might be a brief period where things with the horse are a little messy, or maybe in the case of rehab, rebuilding, reconditioning, a little bit uncomfortable. Now, we don't mean you're exercising your horse when they're in pain, but let me give an example. Let's say, I've heard this, a student will say, well, my horse doesn't like to do ground poles. He doesn't like poles, which I think is kind of funny, because when we've talked about investigative behaviors, I think almost all horses like to smell them and step over them. It doesn't mean they'll perform perfectly, but perfection of performance is a different thing than whether they enjoy it, in my world. Anyway, they'll say, my horse doesn't like poles. And I'll think, well, that's really interesting. Let's give it a try, right? And maybe the horse bumbles around and bumps a couple of poles, right? I've seen many students be unwilling to go further and say, see, the horse doesn't like it, and to me, things might get a little messy if this is a new neuromuscular pattern for the horse, or maybe, to your point, if they're not fully confident yet about what they're doing, things are not going to be perfect off the bat. But we can't say, well, it's not working, therefore the horse doesn't like it. And that was another reason I actually wanted to have this topic, because in some ways you just have to trust the process in certain cases. Now, obviously, if a horse is uncomfortable, there's an underlying condition, or a horse that has high anxiety and you're doing something to kind of feed that anxiety up, that's not the time to push, right? But there are times where an exercise isn't going to go perfectly, and you understand the value of the exercise. As long as the horse isn't stressed by it, there's time to continue with it if they're engaged with it.
Yeah, I think everybody likes to feel successful. So any can help a horse feel successful in what he's doing is going to be good, and encourage his engagement in the process. So it might be a matter of breaking it down. If he bumbles through the poles, maybe he needs fewer poles to start with, or maybe he needs more encouragement. And maybe he needs more encouragement that just the fact that he's tried, you're happy with. I think maybe we need to make sure that they know we're happy with a try, even if the accomplishment isn't perfect. And I think sometimes I think my guys work better when I act more like a dog trainer. The happy, upbeat training mode that many of us go into when we're training our dogs, we tend not to do that, or at least I tend not to do that with my horses. And I think sometimes I bore my horses, so that when I show more enthusiasm and more praise, more like, thank you for trying that. Wow, that was really a good try. And it's like, and laugh when there's a mistake. They love when we laugh at mistakes, because it frees the tension. It says, I'm not going to get on your case about that. It's perfectly okay. Reset. We start all over again. But it keeps them engaged, because they know laughing's a good thing.
I love it. Well, and I think so much of this, we keep coming back to the need to think outside the box a little. And one of the things that I wanted to bounce off you was, so we've already talked about, like, we can't really separate the task at hand from the person who's presenting it to the horse, right? We're all just intertwined. I mean, I've seen some horses seem to be performing dressage or at a show or something with a certain rider, and they just have this presence and this contentment, and the eye is soft. It looks amazing. And then I'll see them an hour later with a different rider, and it's a different picture, very different picture. And to your point, to go back to your coworker example, I mean, similar, right? We can have a completely different energy around one person, and somebody else walks in the room and it's like, oh, we change. And I think horses they are so sensitive to our energy. But one of the things I wanted to ask you in terms of thinking outside the box was, I've known horses that they seem to not enjoy their job in a situational way. Like, and I remember reading a book that John Winnett wrote. This was so long ago, maybe in the mid 90s, maybe somebody who's listening. Did you read that one? He was a neat trainer, but anyway, he cross-trained his dressage horses quite a bit. And he had this one stallion, and he said the horse would become very tense in the arena, and he kept trying. He just couldn't make any progress. But he learned the horse loved to go out in the neighbor's cornfields. He liked wide open spaces, and he could go ride the stallion in this cornfield and work on his flying changes and his half pass. And he could do most of the movements. You can't obviously emulate everything in the rows of corn, but you can do some dressage out there. And that's where he trained the horse mostly. And the horse thrived. They're still doing the same task. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's still the same job, if you will, but it's a different situation. And I've known horses like that for sure. How do you approach that, Lynn? Or does this make sense? Have you encountered horses like that, where maybe in a certain setting they see, and maybe it is from boredom, who's to say, maybe it's that lack of sort of stimulation, mental or socialization, who knows? You change the setting and suddenly it's a whole different ball game.
Oh, I see that with Bronze in the ring. He does what I ask, but not necessarily with great enthusiasm. And if we set up a cross rail, he'd have an anxiety meltdown. Out on the trail, he sees a log ahead of us, and his canter feels like, I got this, just let me go. and he loves to jump logs out on the trail, but he won't jump anything in the arena. It's I think it's very much like what you're describing there. There's a different energy, a different sense of purpose, maybe a different sense of confidence. But I think a lot of getting out of the arena for horses like John Winnett described is there's open space, which makes you feel like forward makes a lot more sense than it does when you see a fence in front of you.
Yeah.
Or there's natural obstacles. You know, bronze wouldn't do a flying change in the arena, but if we're cantering slalom around a bunch of trees in the woods, flying changes are no problem.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's fun anyway, right?
Oh, apparently it is.
I love it. I love it. Well, one thing we were going to cover before Zoom kicks us off was you had posed the question of how fair is it to ask a horse maybe to do a job that they don't like? And that's a hard question. Did you have thoughts on that?
Well, I have some. For one thing, if you mean it to be the horse's main job and they really genuinely don't like it and maybe are not physically or emotionally suited for it, then you're kind of fighting an uphill battle and he's never going to be able to perform his best. On the other hand, if you have a horse who gets to do a lot of something he enjoys and you're going to ask him sometimes to do something he doesn't really think is that much fun, I think it's perfectly fair. We all have to do things we don't necessarily enjoy. I think in Bronze's mind, his job is going out on trails and handling the tough problems that we encounter out on trails. But I wanted to do equagility with him. That's ridden agility. And that means being in the ring. He was like, so about that, because half of each course is me on the ground. That's boring. I don't move fast enough for him. So each time we did an equagility course, I had him practice maybe 20 minutes a week. So this was not an onerous amount of practice.
Yep.
And then when it came time to do the course, invariably, he would play some game, like weave the cones until he got to the last one and then stop and pick it up, which was not part of the course. So I would sometimes have to take him aside and hold his face and look him in the eye and say, Bronze, please just humor me for 10 minutes. When the course is over, you're done for the month, then we'll go for a trail ride. And it was almost like he'd roll his eyes and go, okay. And then he would go. And he ended up in 2018, we were equagility world champions.
Oh, cool.
It was not a job he loved, but he was willing to do it to humor me. I didn't expect him to do it. It was not something he had to do a whole lot of, because we just needed a few minutes of practice every week and real focus for a couple of times while we filmed the course.
Well,
so I go ahead.
What I hear you saying, I love that example, and what I hear you saying just echoes the fact that you had a plan and some creativity and you stuck to it. And that's why it was successful. And so I think we come back to the importance of having, a loose plan. And that's what led to your success. And that's the strategy I've taken with a lot of endurance riders I work with, because both them and their horses realistically, they're more comfortable on the trail. Like that's their jam, that's their thing. But to your point, there are some exercises in the arena that are so beneficial for the balance of the horses that I'll say, look, you don't have to love this. I'm not asking you to do it every day, but at least, twice a week, I want you to do this, this, and this for 10 minutes or 15, whatever I give them as a prescription, because I know how good it is. And as long as it's not causing the horse anxiety, like they might have like this learning bubble over their head, or they might be kind of fumbling around with the coordination, but at least, if they're in it and the rider's like, oh, I can do that. Like I can handle that for 10 minutes. They're still not going to love it. It's not going to replace their trail riding. Trust me. So it's nice to hear you say that sometimes it can be